let's get started then. So if you would, please introduce yourself first.
Yeah, so I am an evolutionary biologist at Queen's University Belfast in the United Kingdom. And I am interested in understanding how life evolves, how species proliferate from one ancestor, how they distribute geographically. And I am interested ultimately in how they are driven to extinction by the same processes. And to achieve those questions, to tackle those questions, to understand the origins and the extinctions of life, I basically connect two major fields. One is evolutionary biology. So I use mostly natural selection and all the other forms of selection that are under natural selection, like sexual selection, which is competition over mates. I connect natural selection, so evolutionary theory, with a field called macroecology. And macroecology is basically the study of biological processes at very large scale. So it could be, for example, instead of working within one place, it is about investigating biological processes at the scale of an entire continent and seeing how those processes vary in different climates across the continent. Or you can go global and investigate the same processes, but at global scale, so across the entire spectrum of organisms for one type of lineage. And most of my research in the last several years has been mostly concentrated on global scale analysis of reptiles and amphibians as a model system to understand what factors drive the evolution of biodiversity and what factors drive their extinctions. As you probably know, amphibians are nature's most endangered animals in the era of climate change, so in the post-industrial era. And therefore, they really hold a key to understand what drives extinctions, which is why I have been focusing my interests on amphibians particularly.
So evolution is this really powerful tool that scientists use to basically understand why living things are the way that they are. And so I was a little surprised when you actually wanted to focus the discussion on extinctions. But then I thought about it a little bit more, and it made a lot of sense if you think about it as sort of the other side of the coin of evolution. If you think about evolution as a species changing to adapt, then extinction is really just when they fail to do that, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. And in some sense, this is actually the norm, whereas evolution is kind of the rare thing. If you think about most species that have ever lived, most of them have no living descendants today. And so if you picture like the tree of life, this big, branching tree, most of those branches are dead. Most of those species are extinct, right?
Yeah. So of, in 3.7 billion years of life in our planet, 99% of species that ever existed are already extinct. So most of life that has been around is now gone.
Good. So the way I kind of wanted to structure our discussion here is just start at the individual, start at the genes, and then kind of work out to the species, and then work out to the things that you focus on, just the sort of ecosystem level of life, right? So let's just start real simple. Hopefully it's a concept everyone knows. Talk about natural selection, fitness, give a primer on that so people kind of make sure that they have a good grounding for what comes later in the discussion.
Yeah, so you mentioned these scaling hierarchies, if you want, of genes and species, individuals, but really the way nature works when we talk about natural selection, it's with a focus on genes. Okay, so our genomes are made of genes, and genes encode traits that make us competitive at certain activities, at finding food and finding mates to spread our genes into the subsequent generations. But really, what is under natural selection is the genes. If you think about the classic concept of individuals competing against each other, the typical thing of the survival of the fittest, it basically focuses on how individuals need to compete more aggressively than others to succeed in the daily life, in the daily battle of survival and reproduction. But nature is full of cooperation. Individuals cooperate with each other, and cooperation involves, sacrificing or investing part of your benefits to increase the benefits of the advantages of others. So cooperation, when you think about cooperation, it goes against the more superficial perspective of individuals competing against each other. And they compete because they have often they have shared genes. So that's why families exist. You have individuals that belong to the same family, and therefore they share the same genes. And that's why they cooperate, because it's genes cooperating with copies of themselves. When they identify other individuals where their copies are also present, they will facilitate behaviors that increase cooperation. So that's why when we talk about natural selection, we need to think a lot. We need to think about genes a lot, because genes are mostly the focus on natural selection. Now, natural selection as a process, we tend to think about it as environmental pressures that make us what we are, promote the evolution of our traits. But really, natural selection, what it is the situation where there is differential mortality and therefore differential survival across individuals in a population as a result of the features they have. So natural selection really is the outcome of the interaction between external pressures. It could be climate, it could be predators, it could be other individuals in your same species, but also the traits you have. Okay, so depending on what you have, on the way you behave, on your body size and stuff like that, those two elements interact, and those will determine your chances of success. Okay, so natural selection is whatever pressure that causes differential mortality. When you can survive to a challenge, you have higher chances of spreading your genes into the next generation, and that therefore leads to evolution in the direction of the individuals that carry those genes that increase in frequency. So if you are very good at competing over certain foods with other individuals in your population, because you have certain traits that increase your chances of being more effective at feeding, therefore you are more likely to increase the frequency with which you spread your genes, and therefore those genes will proliferate and cause evolution. So that's natural selection. It's differential mortality or differential survival as a consequence of the traits you have, and that is why evolution proceeds in the direction of those genes and those traits. Now, like you said, evolutionary change is driven by this engine that we call natural selection. So as environments change, species adapt to those changes by this process of differential mortality. The ones that are not very good are eliminated from the population, and those that are good are the ones that continue to survive. Those are the ones that reach adulthood, the ones that reproduce, and the ones that spread genes. So it's like a process of recruitment, if you think about it. The ones that are not competitive are left behind. The ones that are competitive are the ones that progress, are the ones that spread the genes, and that's how nature evolves. Those pressures that create natural selection for species to adapt could emerge, for example, from environmental changes, climate change, increasing temperatures. It could be because of the immigration of species that a community wasn't used to. For example, if there is a new predator coming into a place that the predator didn't exist before. Now, species were used to each other in that community. They were used to their prey, to their predators, and suddenly you have an alien species invading, which could be for natural causes, or could be because humans are spreading species all over the planet. So that changes the interactions between those communities, within those communities, and that obviously demands that every species in that system needs to re-evolve to adjust to a new predator, to a new prey, to a new type of plant and stuff like that. It can happen if you invade an island, for example, which is the case of many successful lineages that have proliferated very extensively. For example, Darwin's finches, they move from the continent to the islands, and they encounter completely new conditions. And for them to survive in those islands, they will need to change their features. They will need to adapt, to adjust to those new environments. And when the changes are, for example, too drastic, when the environment changes too rapidly, or when the magnitude of those changes is too significant, species might not be able to cope, to catch up with those changes. And that's when the populations enter a process of collapse, a gradual collapse. So it reduces, more individuals die, and more and more and more, until they are not able to continue to cope with those changes and they go extinct. So basically, like you said, evolution and extinctions are the different extremes, the opposite extremes of the same spectrum. Evolution is when you manage to, and extinctions is when you fail to adjust to those changes.
The way I like to think about this, you can tell me if you think this analogy is good, is it's like playing poker, where different players are different genes and they have different strategies for playing the game. And it's not that the best player is winning every hand. He's not taking all the money all the time, but it's a probabilistic thing. Like you said, there's a lot of chance involved. And really, it's just the best strategies increase that chance by a little bit. So slowly over time, you see the person with the best strategy or the genes with the best strategy take all the money or kind of take over the population, and their genes, whatever gene is selected for as being advantageous, their genes will kind of make it into the general population and then change the species as a whole over time.
Yeah, so obviously the key thing in natural selection is that depending on the traits you have, it's a bit more deterministic, because if a trait makes you more competitive, your chances are increased by that trait. So, for example, if you see a predator that has very strong claws, they are very fast and they are very good at remaining spotted, very good at remaining unspotted by the prey, those traits combined will increase the chances of survival. If you think about the process of the spread of genes itself, which is something you achieve through mating, that individuals that can be more attractive to mostly females will be more likely to have access to a sexual partner, so they will be able to spread their genes through reproduction, or in species where males compete against each other to outcompete each other, and then they access to females through those processes. Also, being bigger, being stronger increases your chances. So there is a probability that is intrinsically linked to the expression of the trait.
Okay, good. So let's talk about some of these stories, because evolution is this awesome storytelling tool, right? Each animal sort of has its own story for how it got to be the way it is, why it's shaped the way that it is. And there's interesting stories all around, but there's sort of some universal characteristics that we can think about animals and the selection pressures associated with those characteristics. And there's ones that you study that are things like animal size. Every animal, kind of fits within some certain size range, and that's for a reason, right? It evolved to be a certain size, and then there's some fluctuations there. It can evolve to be bigger, maybe smaller, depending on the environment. So I'd like to talk about animal size, brood size, or I guess the scientific term you guys use is fecundity, maybe lifespan, and some other things as well. But yeah, let's start with animal size, because I find this one really interesting. We think of size as being just sort of always a good thing, right? We want to be bigger than your competitors. If there's a predator-prey interaction, you want to be bigger and stronger than the animal that's trying to get you, or the animal that you're trying to get to eat, basically. And also in mating interactions, you want to be bigger and stronger than your competitor. But of course, with everything, there's sort of a cost benefit to all of these interactions. And so, I'd like to talk about that first and sort of compare those cost benefits for size, which is kind of an easy one to get started with, I think.
Yeah. So first of all, the complexity of the way challenges interact in nature, in the wild, is immense. So if you think about, for example, strategies to evade predation, if you are big like a Komodo dragon or like an elephant, you're certainly avoiding certain risks, but at the same time, body sizes that are small are beneficial in other circumstances. So when the circumstances change, being big is not a good strategy anymore. And this is the way we need to think about nature. Nature is the outcome of evolution, is the outcome of adaptations to the environments. And because we have an enormous range in the body sizes of organisms. So if we only focus on vertebrates, let's forget about insects, let's forget about those organisms that are intrinsically small. The smallest frog, if we focus on land vertebrates, is the size of a fingernail. And the same thing for a chameleon. And then you have things like blue whales. So that huge range of variation in body size, it's there because it's beneficial for the species that has it. So evolution has shaped those species to be either tiny or either massive for a number of reasons. For example, there is this relationship, this relationship between body size and generation length. Yeah. So normally, if you are bigger, you live more years. But there are species that, because of the context they live in, having very short lives is the only reasonable strategy to survive. For example, there are these fish in Africa that live in very dry areas, but they live in these small ponds that form for a couple of months every year. These are called the killifish, and they are the organisms, the vertebrates with the shortest lifespans in nature. So because they're fish, they need to live in ponds, but these ponds are only available for a couple of months per year. So basically their entire lifespan goes from the moment they are born until the moment they are old in only 3 months. The generation length is 3 months. So they manage to occupy that very short period of the year where the spawns are available. And then when they dry out for another 9 months, the eggs they lay before they die, remain in the mud and in the soil for several months, like a little egg. And then when it gets again wet, and there are these tiny ponds that are interconnected in Africa, then they will be born again, they will hatch, they will grow, and they will go their very short lives. So they need to be small for that. We also need to always remember that some organisms are warm-blooded, like mammals and birds, the only warm-blooded animals, which means that through metabolism, we keep our body temperatures constant. Yeah, so that's why in humans it's so dangerous when you get a fever, when you get a temperature, because basically your body is experiencing temperatures that go far beyond this very narrow range of optimal temperatures. If you go out in the winter, you feel cold because your body temperature is constant. So therefore there is a bigger difference with the external environment. That's why you feel cold. The same thing happens for a bird. And that's why you see birds and mammals in the winter, in the snow, happily chasing each other, because they keep their temperature constant and they can function because their metabolism produces that. Now, 99% of the remaining animals, and if we stick to the example of vertebrates, so amphibians and reptiles are cold-blooded, are called ectotherms, which means that they do not produce body heat. Their body heat comes from the external environment. Yeah, so that's why you see reptiles basking, because they have to come out from their shelters in the morning when they are very cold during the night, and they have to bask for an hour or 2 hours or 3 hours until their bodies reach the temperature they need to be able to go out and find food and find mates and dance and display and everything they do. And that's why cold-blooded animals do not feel cold. They don't understand the concept of being cold. They don't need a jacket, because what happens when it's cold is that their metabolism decreases. The life goes slower and slower and slower as it gets colder. They will never have this sense of I'm very cold that animals with constant temperatures have. When sometimes you're working on snakes that are poisonous, you can put them in a fridge for a couple of minutes so the metabolism goes down and you can manipulate them better. So organisms are cold-blooded and are warm-blooded, different organisms. So if you think about, for example, a reptile, where do you find the biggest reptiles? Crocodiles, Komodo dragons, big iguanas, and all those things in tropical environments. And that is basically because their temperature, their optimal body temperature to perform the biological activities comes from the environment, from the sun, from the external environment. And the environments in tropical regions are very hot. They can afford to have a massive body because they get hot very quickly. If you think about one of those big reptiles, think about a Komodo dragon in a high mountain where it's very cold, where the days are very short, where the temperatures are really low, and where the breeding season, so the summer season, is really short. They might need days basking in those very low temperatures. So they might come out in the morning, stay basking day after day, and never reach the body temperature. So being big in those environments for a cold-blooded organism is not a good business, it's not a good strategy. So what natural selection does is, from across the variation of body sizes for a species, it starts to eliminate the ones that are too big and keeps the very small ones that come out, jump on a rock, bask for 15 minutes or 45 minutes, and can spend the rest of the 5 hours of moderate, mediocre sun finding mates, finding food, escaping effectively the predators, and so on. So body size it's extremely variable because the demands are extremely variable. So there is no one effective body size. Every body size exists because it is effective for the context of a species in the area where the species exists. And you have within the same community, species are very small and others are huge because they need to occupy the niches. And for some of them, there is a niche which requires being small. And for others, there is a niche that requires being large.
Yeah, that's an important idea of niche filling in nature.
It's one thing I forgot to say in relation with your question about fecundity and production of babies. This is a very quick and important thing. Again, when we think about a relationship between body size and fecundity, so the numbers of babies, that clutch size or brood size that females produce, in the case of warm-blooded organisms, so birds and mammals, there is a negative tendency between numbers of babies and body size. So bigger animals like elephants and whales normally produce one baby. And as you go down, think about cats that produce 5 or 6, and then go down to rats or small rodents, they produce, I don't know, 15 or 20. So there is, the bigger you are, the lower the numbers of babies you produce. If you go back to ectotherms, to animals with cold blood, again, let's stick to the example of vertebrates, amphibians and reptiles, it's totally the opposite. The bigger the body size of the mom, the higher the number of babies they can accommodate because they have more space. So if you have within the same species a very small female, she could produce, for example, 2,000 eggs, and a female of the same species that is a lot larger could produce 6,000 eggs. Within the same species, you have thousands of eggs of variation, which are a direct consequence of having a larger body size, which simply provides more room to accommodate more babies and more room to accommodate more storage of fats, to have the energy you need to invest into the productivity of those, into the production of those eggs.
And so the different strategies there, some people might think just more is better, but it's also that you want to give your children a better chance to survive,
Exactly.
Right? And so that's why mammals have live birth, because they've adopted that strategy of, all right, when you're young, you're really vulnerable, so we're going to kind of keep you around. We're going to put more energy into a fewer of the offspring and give them a better chance of surviving. Whereas a lot of egg-laying animals, especially ones that are laying thousands of eggs, are just putting those eggs out there, and you're just playing a numbers game at that point.
It is that. I mean, you need to think about nature, the wild, as a battlefield. Is something that for humans is sometimes difficult to really think about. When you live in the wild, you need to be really sharp in terms of the strategies you need to survive. Animals in the wild get up in the morning, and it's one day at a time. Every day is a challenge. You get up in the morning, you are really paranoid looking around for predators. You can never stop thinking about the dangers. You need to, live your daily life, keeping an eye on predators, being ready to engage in a fight with your neighbor if food is a very limited resource. You need to be ready for that. In our species, we don't have that sort of lifestyle. If you are hungry, you are not going to go with a gun to kill your neighbor to get food. We have massive productions of food that make it a resource that is not under the level of competition that it is in the wild, where you need to kill others, or at least fight very fiercely to be able to eat. In humans, it doesn't happen. If you think about people who go out on Saturdays and then they have a couple of drinks, who walks back home thinking about predators? You just walk home. You are not paranoid. Just say you can afford to do that because they know there will be no dangers. If you think about that in the wild and there will be predators lurking around, you could think twice about making yourself vulnerable. So what the way we see nature in our daily lives is not the same way that organisms see nature in the wild. You can project your life for the next 10 years and think, so in 10 years, I'm going to be doing this today to have certain things in 10 years. In nature, is literally one day at a time. You need to survive every day. And your challenge is to go to bed at night. And then when you get up in the morning, your challenge is, again, getting through the day to go to bed at night. So organisms accommodate their strategies to be as effective as they can. So in the case of mammals, as you said, mammals have decided evolutionarily to produce babies that are more vulnerable. But to compensate for that, we have evolved parental care, which is really widespread. Most of animals which are warm-blooded have parental care. So they protect their babies that are very vulnerable. So parents have to stay around them. In the case of other organisms, again, reptiles and amphibians, you can produce a lot of babies and they can see how they survive, but the strategy is different. If you have one baby or 3 babies, you really need to look after them to make sure they reach adulthood, because that's the challenge of life. Life is not about surviving. Life is not about being happy. Life in the wild is about surviving to reach adulthood, to achieve your aim, which is spreading your genes into the next generation. Okay, so in a way, surviving is just a prerequisite to reproduce. So your parents invest all this energy. We go back to the discussion about genes and individuals and selfish genes and selection on genes. So parents invest all this effort and risk their lives in going out to keep feeding their babies and protect them against dangers, because those babies carry copies of their genes. So it's the genes of the parents promoting the behavior of the parents to protect the babies that are copies of the genes, new copies of the genes that need to survive to keep spreading in subsequent generations. When the strategy is alternative, so you produce 8,000 eggs, it's basically like playing several lottery tickets. They are born, they run away in all directions, and most of them will be killed by predators. But if you play more tickets, you believe that you have more chances to survive. So it's alternative strategies. And of course, in the case of species that produce lots of babies, they don't bother about parental care. There's no need to parental care. There is no need. This is going to sound a bit strong, but maternal love, this very romantic concept we have about, parents loving their children, is really business. It's evolutionary business. You need to evolve maternal and paternal love when you need to make sure that your babies need the protection to grow, to reach adulthood, to spread genes. When your strategy involves producing lots of babies, then there is no need for maternal love. Mothers don't need to love their babies because it's too expensive. And because nature is a battlefield, there's no time for feelings. It's all about surviving. It's all about finding the best combination of strategies. So if you produce lots of babies, don't look after them. That's your strategy. If you produce a few, then your nature will make you feel love for them. And that love is basically the instinct of protecting them to make sure that they develop into successful adults. So it all sounds a bit cold, but nature is about business strategies. It's about business strategies that organisms apply to increase their chances of reproduction. You said fitness, and fitness is basically the numbers of successful babies you produce, is not the numbers of babies. Okay, you can produce a lot of babies and that could lead to a reduction in fitness. So you produce the right numbers of babies depending on what you can provide, or the strategies you have, or the sorts of environments you live in. It's all down to business.
So we talked about, these are strategies that animals have to adapt to their environment. But let's shift over to the extinction part. I wonder if you could talk about the things that we just talked about in terms of evolution, but then talk about them in terms of extinction, basically, to see if there's better strategies.
Yeah, so one of the things we have learned in the past couple of decades by integrating research, biological research from so many different perspectives, is that extinctions really are the outcome of so many different factors interacting with each other, and it depends on the context and how they interact. Okay, so yes, there are some things that keep coming up as consistent predictors of extinction risk. But sometimes those very powerful predictors need other things to become a real threat. So that's one of the most important lessons to learn, that extinctions are the outcome of many interactions, and that's interactions of many factors, of many stressors and circumstances. And that's why to make accurate predictions about the extinction risk of a species, we call extinction risk this estimates we make about how likely a species is to face or be driven to extinction in the next couple of decades. So species are assigned an index, a category, which represents the likelihood, and those categories are intrinsically based on several different factors that interact. It's a bit like the insurance industry, you see. So when you apply for car insurance, they basically ask you a lot of questions. Your history as a driver, if you have points in your license, if you have speeding tickets, your age, your job, if you are married or not, all these things combine into an algorithm, into a formula that will provide a final score, which is the combination of everything. Sometimes a lot of something will be compensated by a little of something. Sometimes in the middle of all of them will give you a score. And that's what we do, okay? So many things play a role in extinctions, and that's very important to keep in mind. But there are traits that are very important, and there are circumstances in the environment that are very important. So just like natural selection is the outcome of the features of an organism and the pressures in the environment interacting together and determining the chances of survival, extinction is the same. Okay, so for example, if you live in an environment where temperature is changing, and the temperature changes is changing the vegetation, for example, or the coverage of certain plants, and with that, the availability of certain insects that you used to eat, that are part of your food. A good strategy that will buffer the risk of extinction is having a lot of babies, because basically you are playing more lottery tickets. So you can have babies that are very specialists in one type of insect, but you might have others that are weirdos, if you want, that will be willing to go for something that is not very usual in the population. So when you have more variation, you have more chances of accessing more unusual things. And we have learned that more babies tends to reduce the risk of extinction. As you reduce the numbers of babies you produce, then you are more likely to be threatened because you have lower levels of variation in your brood. You probably are aware of this growing idea that larger animals tend to be more endangered, more prone to extinction than smaller ones, which is true. But it's true when you think about, for example, mammals, which have been the focus of that research. So bigger mammals are more endangered. And one of the reasons that could be behind that process is precisely because bigger mammals produce fewer babies. You know, we said that as you are smaller, you have more babies if you are a mammal, but as you get bigger, the numbers of babies decrease. So because every big mammal has a very long generation and very few babies, their pace of evolution is really slow relative to other mammals that are very small, that have generations of 1 or 2 years and produce several babies per year. If you go back to the ectotherms, to the cold-blooded organisms, because it is the opposite, you could expect that bigger bodied animals are less endangered because they produce more babies, and that's exactly what happens. So if you think about amphibians, for example, smaller amphibians are more endangered than bigger amphibians. Smaller mammals are less endangered than big mammals. So it's totally the opposite tendency. But when you plot extinction risk against numbers of babies, you get a consistent tendency where animals that produce fewer babies are more likely to face extinction risk, which leads to bigger frogs to be safer because they produce a lot of babies, and bigger mammals to be less safe because they produce fewer. Generation length is another one. So if you live 70 years and you reproduce every 10 or something like that, you have very slow pace of life, and your gestation, your pregnancies are, you know, like in our species, 9 months or a year and a half or something like that. Obviously, the impact of a rapidly changing environment is more severe, because within the course of one generation, you can feel a lot of changes, and the replacement of generations, the recruitment of individuals that are catching up with those changes is slower. Other factors more external. So we are talking about numbers of babies and generation length, which is organismal features, is your intrinsic features. But if that interacts with, for example, a very rapid change of the temperatures, then these things start to interact. And when the change in temperature is really quick, for example, like in high elevation mountains, which tends to be the rate of climate change tend to be faster than in other regions, then obviously you need to catch up quicker. So that's where you have an interaction between external and internal factors. There is a very universal effect of the size of your geographic area. So if you live on the top of a mountain, for example, if you evolve to live in the top of a mountain, you obviously have traits that evolutionarily made you able to survive in a small region because you can reproduce faster or whatever it is. But when the environment changes, if you live in a small region, you are less likely to be able to radiate into other regions. So basically your risk of experiencing what we call a demographic collapse. So a loss of population densities over time very quickly until the population is a sustainable increase. So low numbers of babies, small geographic range sizes, slow pace of evolution, all these things interact to increase extinction risk. And environmental change involves obviously habitat degradation. If we destroy an environment, if we transform an environment that used to be the home, the habitat for certain organisms, and then it's degraded, obviously that's very rapid environmental change. So it's interactions of many things.
Yeah, I think that's what people tend to understand about extinction as well. They kind of see the list of animals that people are worried about, and they're these big charismatic animals. I wonder too, so we talked at the very beginning about the genes and basically the turnover rate for how fast the genes are able to get into a population and change it to adapt that population. But I wonder as well, the bigger species seem to be more adaptable within their lifespan. Does that make sense? Like a lot of small animals, especially insects, they'll only eat like one kind of plant. And if that plant's gone, then okay, you're out of luck. Whereas big animals, they have big ranges. They can move to different places. They can eat different things. They have this sort of adaptability just by dint of being bigger, and they can do more things to survive, I guess.
There is a lot of that. Yes. For example, if you are an animal that is an insectivore, you eat insects, and you obviously will eat the insects that you can physically swallow. So if you get bigger and you are still an insectivore, you have a wider range of options available for you to eat, because you can possibly swallow a bigger range of things. If you are a large lizard, you can eat the only things that small lizards can eat, but you can also eat very large things that small lizards cannot eat. So your range expands. Think about like the physical coverage. If you are a big mammal, for example, those that live in massive areas in Africa, as they move around, they cover a lot of different environments. As they migrate, they cover lots of different environments. So their tolerances are naturally high. In other organisms that live in very restricted environments, that's what they are evolved to live. So if you think about reptiles, for example, that we normally associate reptiles with hot climates, and there is this typical thought that reptiles, because they are cold-blooded, that's where they are happy. But it turns out that in mountain reptiles, for example, where they have evolved to be adapted to very low temperatures, as climate change, as climate warming goes up in the mountains and reaches those lizards that are specialized in very cold environments, which tend to be small so they can bask and get hot quicker, basically they start to roast because they're not used to temperatures like that. And what happens is that as the environments have changed, they need to retreat in shelters where they are not exposed to these increasingly hotter days. And that obviously compromises the chances of going out to eat and mate. And they spend most of the time escaping the sun, which sometimes doesn't make sense because they are reptiles, but it happens because they are adapted to cold climates. A hotter climate is really damaging for them. And that's how the populations start to decrease, because they are not going out to mate, they are not going out to feed, and the populations decrease over time until they go extinct.
And do you ever think much about intelligence as an adaptive trait? It's sort of a complex and harder to quantify in terms of, like you do with brood size or animal size, but finding solutions to novel problems is sort of the definition of intelligence. And so you're in a changing environment, perhaps just being smarter is a good trait to have.
Again, life is too complex and circumstances
Okay.
are too variable. So I have been talking about how having small clutches can be beneficial, or having large clutches can be beneficial, or being big can be beneficial, or being small can be beneficial. The same thing happens with intelligence. So we tend to use as a proxy is that animals with bigger brains relative to the body sizes are smarter. In mammals, we have the neocortex, which is this external layer of very complex neurons, which gives you an indication of how smart an animal can be. Yeah. So we tend to equalize brain size relative to your body size with intelligence. Now, there are two processes that are in conflict in this situation. One is, yes, as you evolve more intelligence, more cognitive capacities through the complexity that a bigger brain can provide, you develop something that is called behavioral flexibility. And behavioral flexibility means the ability of an individual to react to unexpected challenges in an effective way. Yeah. So if you are not expecting a predator, if you are not expecting whatever challenge that is very critical for your survival, when it happens suddenly, you need to make a decision. You need to make a decision about where you've run away, how you run away, how you react to certain environment. If your food is disappearing, you need to have the flexibility to adjust to other types of food that you're not naturally used to it. So that behavioral flexibility, it's a very straightforward outcome of being more intelligent. And it has been shown in some animals, for example, in birds, in mammals, that having more behavioral flexibility as a consequence of a more developed brain, so being more intelligent, can really buffer the risks of your environment to keep your survival going. That's one part of the story. The other side of the coin, as you said in the beginning, is that having a bigger brain is really costly. Okay, so everything in nature is balanced by the cost and benefits. And, if it was just about having the best version of a trait, everybody would. The problem is that having good versions of a trait requires energy that you invest in those traits. Okay, so for example, if you produce a lot of babies, you're investing a lot of your energy into it, which is why animals partition the reproductions into different years to be able to spread those costs over a long period. If you live in a place that is really dangerous and you don't know whether you will be alive tomorrow, it's a better strategy to invest all your money, your energy into one big basket, because you don't know what happens tomorrow, and then let's see what happens tomorrow. With the brain, it's the same thing. The brain is one of the most expensive tissues in the body. So maintaining a brain is really costly. And therefore, as organisms evolve, bigger brains, they get the benefits of that, but they also have the cost of compromising other parts of your life, or the other traits. For example, there is this hypothesis that in some animals, the more you invest in the brain, the less you can invest in the testicles. So there has been this relationship between animals with large brains and very small testicles, and others in the same species with very, very large testicles and very small brains. So you're a very good reproducer, but not a very good thinker, or you're a very clever individual, but not a very good reproducer. And it's because there is this trade-off in the allocation of whatever you have available in terms of energy, in terms of access to food, to allocate in those traits. So when you put too much into the development of the brain, you compromise other things. And that's what leads to the second side of the coin, which is that in many organisms, it has been found that investing in a bigger brain that could give you benefits for being smart can really reduce your lifespan, can really reduce your investment of resources into your body health. In some animals, a bigger brain means a longer lifespan because their circumstances, for example, having an environment full of food, can make that a big brain is viable. But in other circumstances where food is a challenge, you might need to think about surviving without being very smart, because investing too much in the brain to be too smart could in fact result in a lower level of success compared to being physically healthier or producing more sperm to produce more babies. So you can get both scenarios. In reptiles and amphibians, for example, it has been found that having a brain that is too large can be too costly because of the energetic costs involved in the development of a brain. So they tend to favor physical health and longer lifespans rather than massive, clever brains. In other animals like mammals and birds, it has been shown a lot that investing in big brains is good, because it might probably have something to do with the intrinsic levels of cognitive capacities. Mammals have a neocortex, which no other animals have. So that is a very complex part of the brain that is the part of the brain that gives us what we call intelligence, the ability to make very complex decisions. So if you think about that, investing into a very heavy brain, it's a really good strategy. I mean, think about humans. If you think about the evolutionary history of the brain of humans, it used to be not very large, and suddenly there was a massive increase when humans started to learn about cooperation, about the ability to hunt together for animals that were bigger, that provided fatty meat. When humans discovered those behavioral features that increase success, communal success, they started to employ them. And when they started to employ them and have these groups of men that would go out and hunt massive animals that otherwise are very dangerous to hunt if you go on your own, that provided lots of energy, extra energy in the fatty meat for the brain development, and the brain developed heavily. So, and then we have the highest levels of behavioral flexibility of any organism on Earth, and probably that any species that ever lived. And the result of that is our capacity to survive. We build houses, we have technologies, we have computers, we have medicine, we have all the things that are the result of our intelligence, because obviously it paid off to invest into heavy brains. If you go to organisms that have like a base level of lower levels of cognitive complexity, if you invest a lot into the brain, maybe it's not that much more that you will achieve. And you can compromise a lot by compromising your health, by investing everything you have into the brain. So if you partition more into body health, into your testicles to produce more babies, and you have a smaller brain, you might end up with a higher overall level of fitness, so more successful babies, and therefore a brain is not necessarily a good strategy.
Yeah, I read an article that had sort of an interesting theory I want to get your opinion on. There's an idea that body size is able to change faster than brain size, basically, evolutionarily speaking. It's a much more simple task to build the organs in your skeleton and your muscles than it is to build up the structure of your brain. So they thought that, you mentioned the brain size relative to body size as being important for what we think of as intelligence. And they thought that basically, if you look to your ancestors and whether you're shrinking relative to them or growing relative to them, you're going to have a relatively bigger or smaller brain. And so they thought that animals that were relatively smaller than their ancestors have bigger brains relative to their bodies. And it's just sort of this carry-on effect, this intelligence, just, okay, we got to use this big brain for something, and then they become more intelligent that way. Is that something you've encountered?
Yeah. I mean, yes, that's true in the species that where that hypothesis has been tested. But again, there's no a linear relationship between brain size and intelligence. I mean, I don't think anybody could argue that a blue whale is smarter than a human overall, and the size of the brain of a blue whale is a lot bigger than a human. So you can become very small and have a certain ratio between your brain size and your body size, but still the levels of intelligence will be determined by other things. Obviously, the brain relative to the body size has a role, but you have to have a certain size of brain. If you put the relationship between body size and brain size, encephalization in humans is higher than any other thing, despite the fact the brain is smaller and the body size is smaller. And it's because we have a massive neocortex that receives a lot of energy. I think the figure is something like a quarter of the energy we consume goes just to the brain. And keep in mind that because we need to keep our body temperature high, because we are endotherms, a lot of the energy we consume goes just to keep the body temperature going. So we can have all sorts of discussions about specific situations, but the evolution of the brain is really complex, and there is certain tendencies, but those are broken by other tendencies that take part in it, which breaks the linearity, which again, you have crows that are very small brains, but they are very clever. You have humans that are, medium-sized mammals only, and they are very, very, very clever. And then there are so many more organisms that have much bigger brains as an absolute measure of size than us, but they are not even close to our intelligence. So it's relative to body size, but it's relative to other things too.
Okay. And there's also this idea that animals tend to evolve to be bigger over time, and then the bigger ones tend to go extinct. So it's like and sort of be replaced. Then I suspect you're gonna say it's more nuanced than that, but maybe you could speak to that idea.
Yeah, I mean, those sort of macroecological or macroevolutionary patterns, have been studied. Sometimes they reveal something. Sometimes they reveal something because they come from certain organisms, and depending on their certain periods of their evolutionary history and how the planet has been changing the paradigms of life. If you think about dinosaurs, which we tend to think about them as massive animals, that's what is fascinating about dinosaurs. Dinosaurs evolved from reptiles that were the size of a cat. Very small things after this massive mass extinction, the end Permian extinction, which killed nearly everything on Earth. In the aftermath of that, there were these very small things that became these massive dinosaurs. But then there was another mass extinction that led to birds, which are the dinosaurs that survived. Dinosaurs never went extinct. There were small dinosaurs that managed to survive. So you have these tendencies where body size can increase and then decrease, and it depends on the period you pick, it depends on the lineages you pick, and sometimes organisms have the tendency to get smaller over time or bigger over time. And obviously when certain organisms and certain sequence of studies lead to the identification of certain patterns, it's quite appealing to think that might be a tendency, but we have learned that those tendencies always have a lot of exceptions, and that's another important lesson. Like we said, big body size and more extinction risk, that's appealing as an idea, because you could use body size as a proxy, but it's not as simple as that. If you change the focus to other types of organisms, it turns out that bigger organisms, for example, amphibians or reptiles, are less endangered. And there is a mechanistic explanation, which is in this case numbers of babies. And there is this very widespread theory called Berman's rule, which predicts that animals evolve bigger body sizes towards colder climates. So as you move away from the tropics, body sizes get bigger, because if you have a bigger body, you have more biomass, more flesh, and therefore temperature will get preserved inside more easily. So if you get really hot, then you can preserve the temperature better, which leads to this prediction that living in colder environments, it's a good advantage. But as we interrogate that prediction, we have found all sorts of patterns and all sorts of exceptions, and sometimes new patterns. So, there are these rules that emerge that can be very appealing, but as more people interrogate them with different types of organisms in different contexts with different methods, we always find exceptions. Different periods of the evolutionary history of a lineage, it changes a lot.
Okay, so you don't think these general rules are often very valuable?
I believe in some of them. I believe some of them are general, but I believe some of them require more complexity to really understand the way they work. For example, I believe in the rule that fewer babies tends to reduce your chances of or increase your risk of extinction. But there are exceptions precisely because all of these things are the result of many things interacting with each other. So we have spoke about energy investment into the brain, how the brain can benefit flexibility. But it turns out that if you invest too much, then you compromise reproduction and so on and so forth. So it's biology is a lot about, it's very context dependent. It's about exactly the challenges you have in a certain place and how you adjust all these traits you have for those conditions. So some things remain like very consistent patterns, small range sizes, more extinction risk. I believe personally in the fewer babies, more extinction risk, but there are always exceptions. And sometimes something that happens in a way in one continent is reversed entirely in the other. We can see patterns that look really appealing and consistent in, for example, in the Americas. But then you go and test it in Europe or in Eurasia, and you find that the patterns are the opposite. So the same organisms addressed in different continents reveal different tendencies in the way they evolve, because it's very context dependent. So I believe in rules. I believe in some of them, but in many others, I don't personally believe. And I don't believe, based on the evidence, that they can be quite chaotic and lots of conflicting evidence.
Good. Okay, I like that answer. The Earth goes through sort of more stable and less stable periods in time, and in the more stable times, we tend to see more species evolving and growing, and then we have some dramatic thing that happens, usually either to like an area or to the whole planet all at once, and we see this really dramatic contraction of life. There's famous extinction events throughout history, and we're living through one now that you study as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So, okay, so let's start with a fundamental principle, and that is that evolution is constantly happening. Okay, so evolution is constantly happening in any point of time, in any period of the planet. There is always evolutionary change happening. Okay, so evolution never stops. Evolution is not just promoted by, like we said, massive changes in the climate, but also by interactions within communities with other species. If one species declines in abundance for whatever reason, then others will evolve in a different ways. Species are very, if we use human terms, very imperialist. They tend to constantly be expanding into whatever opportunity for niche expansion they have. So if there is a species that lives constrained by competition with other species, they will stay there because that's their safe operating space. But if one of the species around them suffers some sort of decline, they will immediately take the opportunity to invade those bits of niche space, and that's the way it works. So first principle to keep in mind is that evolution is constantly happening. Now, yes, the planet has been through a number of very dramatic episodes that have killed life. If we think about multicellular life, so after life became organisms made of several cells like us, not just bacteria and stuff like that, there have been 5 mass extinctions, which is 5 episodes of incredible levels of stress that the planet has experienced, which has killed substantial numbers of organisms around. So a mass extinction, there have been 5, like I said, is like roughly defined as an episode of extinction that wipes out around 3/4 of diversity on Earth. So think about the significance of that. And there have been 5 of those. The most dramatic of those was in the end Permian, which is roughly 250 million years ago. And that's the worst episode of extinction that has ever been recorded in the history of Earth. The end Permian extinction 250 million years ago exterminated 96% of life on Earth. So pretty much everything that existed was exterminated by. There was huge levels of volcanic eruptions, and the volcanic eruptions contaminated the atmosphere, and they caused massive levels of climate change, a total disruption of the planet, and nearly everything died. The other mass extinctions, the other 4 mass extinctions, are not as dramatic as that one, but they have led to a significant loss of biodiversity in episodes every couple of hundreds of millions of years. So the last mass extinction was the extinction that happened at the end of the Cretaceous that killed the dinosaurs and many other organisms, but that was 66 million years ago. So between those periods, you have, like you said, some form of stability where life stays, but still there are extinctions all the time, still there is evolution all the time, still there is new forms of species that emerge, new traits, new strategies that happens between those episodes of mass extinction. The important thing to keep in mind is that mass extinctions, because they wipe out a huge significant proportion of life, they have been the episodes that have changed the paradigms of life every time they happen. Okay, it's like deleting everything you know and start filling with whatever will emerge from what you have. So that happens with life. It's deleting everything and starting again. So it's a fresh start with whatever was left. And the aftermath of mass extinctions normally leads to the emergence of entirely new concepts or new paradigms of life. So end Permian extinction, the one that I said that is the biggest in history, that killed 96% of biodiversity, that one, when all of that diversity was exterminated by planetary processes of huge levels of stress, that precisely led to the emergence of dinosaurs. So dinosaurs are a consequence, this new form of life, it's a consequence of that. So dinosaurs emerged, these big things, but then dinosaurs were really successful, were around the planet, occupying the niches around the planet. So the opportunities for other organisms were not very, very significant. When you think about a niche, think about the chairs in a cinema room. If you go to the cinema and everybody is sitting on a chair, there's no space for you. There's no niche for you, and you have to walk away, which means being extinct. Or you could choose to fight someone who is sitting on a chair, which is competition in ecological terms. And if you're stronger, you could end up sitting in that niche and sending the other one that was occupying the niche to extinction, or you could be outcompeted and be driven to extinction anyway. Dinosaurs had occupied a significant number of the chairs in the cinema room, okay? And that was the paradigm of life. There were other things in the period of the dinosaurs, like ammonites and all those organisms. The marine life was badly affected, more badly affected than the land life, with the extinction of the dinosaurs, of the Cretaceous extinction. After that extinction happened, you know, we know this asteroid that hit the planet in interaction with volcanic activities and stuff like that. Dinosaurs went extinct. 75% of life in the oceans went extinct. And then you have this massive decline in biodiversity 66 million years ago, which is similar to, it's a lot lower, but in terms of the shock for the planet, for the biodiversity, like the end Permian, which was 96%. But what happens is that a mass extinction is an opportunity for new forms of life to evolve, because all the niches that were taken by the things that were taking those niches, now they are available. So it's like the cinema room is full and suddenly it's empty. Okay, so there are lots of opportunities. Following the extinction of the dinosaurs, mammals took over and started to proliferate. We are mammals. Birds used to be just a handful of species restricted to South America. Following the extinction of most of the dinosaurs, they proliferated. They were the dinosaurs that survived. Amphibians proliferated following the extinction of dinosaurs and so on. So we are used to this life where you go out and see birds and see mammals and see frogs. That is our very natural perception of life. But that paradigm of life is what we got as a consequence of the extinction in the end Cretaceous, when dinosaurs and 75% of life in the oceans went extinct. So everything changed. If you're more extreme, there is this episode, this is a hypothesis that has been contested by some people, but there is a lot of evidence that seems to prove it, which around 650 million years ago, life on Earth was unicellular. So biodiversity was made of organisms that were only one cell of size. So biodiversity was everywhere, but if you could have a walk around some continent, you could see just soil, nothing at all. And that was full of biodiversity. we are used to think about biodiversity as trees and flowers and butterflies and lizards and birds flying around. That is biodiversity. If you go 600 or 700 million years ago, because all life on Earth was unicellular organisms, you needed a microscope to see them. So you could walk around and see nothing, even if you were walking on a massive hotspot of biodiversity. There was another experience of that shocked the planet in those 600, 650 million years ago, which is called the snowball Earth. The entire planet became frozen. So it looked from the poles to the tropics, it was completely frozen. It looked like a snowball. Obviously, an episode of that level of stress kills everything. But once the ice retreated, those cells that managed to survive started to cooperate with each other. And this cooperation led to, according to this hypothesis, to a higher chance of surviving. And that is what apparently promoted the evolution of multicellular life. So there was this massive episode of mortality, of huge levels of destruction of life that was followed by the evolution of a completely new paradigm, which in this case was multicellular life. And as multicellular life started to become more prominent, they started to produce more oxygen. The oxygen in the atmosphere increased. So there is this increase in oxygen in the atmosphere that enabled more life to evolve, which was a consequence of that life evolving. So it's this feedback loop between one thing and the other. And then we carry on for the subsequent 600 million years that followed, with those paradigms of life changing, the end Permian, the dinosaurs, the extinction of dinosaurs, and the emergence, not the origin, but the proliferation. They existed from before, but this proliferation of other forms of life that were restricted in their potential because of other things were taking the niches. Birds, like I said, are the only dinosaurs that survived, and we see birds today. We see dinosaurs. Really, it's that one branch that managed to escape the extinction. And today we are entering a sixth mass extinction, which is the one that humans have created with our activities on the planet's environment. So we are starting, after all these 66 million years of extraordinary evolution that have led to the evolution of whales, evolution of 11,000 birds, 8,500 amphibians, 11-something thousand reptiles, and so on, and several thousands of 5,000-6,000 mammals. All of these periods of 66 million years of stability are now entering this crisis that is being instigated by human activities. And we are now entering the sixth mass extinction, which is different to the previous ones. And it's different because it's the only one that has been caused by one single species. Turns out our species evolved just very recently in terms of the history of the planet. We have been around as humans for not even 200,000 years. So that's a blink of an eye, evolutionarily speaking. And in that very short period of time, our species has become the most cooperative thing that ever lived, the smartest species that ever lived, the most influential species that ever lived. And we have changed the environment to the extent that we are entering a sixth mass extinction as a consequence of one species that appeared a blink of an eye ago.
Good. Yeah, I want to dig more into that and sort of the causes of it. First, I guess I want to talk just some numbers that really illustrate the impact that humans are having, because people, like you said, people think species are constantly going extinct just naturally over time. There doesn't need to be some dramatic change for animals to go extinct, but there's some numbers that prove that we really are having a dramatic change very quickly on the number of species that are in the environment. Perhaps more dramatically, visually, if you want to think about it, is the number of animals, not necessarily the diversity, but we're losing basically 40% number is what I saw for a lot of land animals, ocean animals, birds.
Yeah, so there are lots of key numbers here. First of all, let's start by what you said. So we know roughly 1.92 million species today. That is what we have managed to discover and catalog and give a scientific name. So we are talking about, let's say, roughly 2 million species. The estimates, based on realistic predictions, suggest that the numbers of species could be up to 12 million. So if you think about it, we know a very small proportion. There are other estimates that I personally think go too far, which suggest up to 100 million species that actually live on Earth, but I think that's way too much. So like the normal, more robust explanations go for 3 million, 4 million to 12 million, sometimes 15 million species. Whatever that range is, if we say, let's stick around an average of 8 or 9 million species, which is the midpoint between those extremes, we have only discovered a quarter of life on Earth if we stick to the average between the range of estimates. Yeah. If we think about 12 million species, we have discovered a very small proportion of them. So extinctions are happening, not just on the species we know, but also on the species we still don't know they are there. And many species have gone extinct before we even managed to know they existed. Okay. Now, today, it's 28% of biodiversity on Earth that is endangered, that is facing risk of extinction. This is with the current levels of climate change, current levels of habitat degradation, current levels of overexploitation, current levels of declines of pollination, etc., etc. That is 28%. So we are talking about something between a quarter and a third of life on Earth. It's endangered. Now, if we think about species that are actually extinct, because we have managed to declare them extinct based on the ones that we have discovered, we are talking only about a 1% of them, but that doesn't really represent the extent of the crisis. So estimates based on the actual numbers of species we believe that exist on Earth range between 11,000 and nearly 60,000 species being lost every single year. Okay, animals. So because there is a huge proportion, whatever your preferred number, we are not even in half of the biodiversity. If we go to the lowest estimates, we haven't even reached half of the species on Earth. But again, a conservative estimate is, let's say, 8 to 9 million species. We have discovered a quarter or less. So the same extinction processes we are seeing in the little proportion we know is also happening in the big proportion we don't know. So the estimates suggest that we could be losing up to 58, 60,000 species every single year. Now, that is the level of extinction caused by human impacts on the environment, mostly in post-industrial age. Okay, those numbers have to be assessed or weighted against what we call a background rate of extinction, which is basically extinction by natural causes or without human intervention. So let's go back to the Middle Age or before. The background rate of extinction, just to give you an idea, roughly is 1 mammal every 100 years. So it's really low. Okay, we have broken that, and today the estimate by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, which is called as IUCN, which is the global body that is in charge of managing the estimates of extinction risk of biodiversity. The estimate is that the extinction rates caused by human activities in the environment vary between 1,000 and 10,000 times higher than the background rates of extinction, so extinctions without humans. So we have accelerated extinction risk in thousands of numbers. That is the extent of the problem, and we only can quantify this based on what we know, but we can make all these predictions. Now, the IUCN, this International Union for Conservation of Nature, going back to what we spoke in the beginning, they take all this combination of traits to calculate the extinction risk of a species, and they assign a category, okay, a conservation category, which could be least concern, which means a species is safe and there is no need to worry about it. It could be vulnerable, it could be threatened or critically endangered, and depending on the levels of extinction risk, they are assigned a category. Okay, so there are 3 categories, vulnerable, endangered, and critically endangered, that alert us that those species are facing a risk of extinction, and those species in those categories in total amount to 28% of biodiversity today. Okay, now the issue is that one thing is the conservation category that is assigned to a species, but another one is the observation of their population tendencies. Yeah, so we have species that have a given tag, which could be, for example, least concern or nearly threatened, but those species could be declining over time. If we take a snapshot of the level of threat today, they might be doing just fine. But if you measure their populations over time, you could find that they are declining rapidly over time. So you could reasonably think that if they are okay or not very threatened or just vulnerable today, but they continue to decline, in a couple of decades, they will be more vulnerable, or probably they will be facing very serious risk of extinction. For example, 41% of amphibians have been given a conservation category that put them in a level of threat. So 41% of amphibians are threatened with extinction. When we count the numbers of amphibians that are actually declining over time, we are above 60%. So there is this gap in the actual tendencies of their populations and their conservation categories, which makes the story scarier. And again, if you extrapolate to the fact that we probably haven't even discovered 25% of life on Earth, that really gives you, a sense of the magnitude of the numbers, which are massive. Extinction obviously benefits all the species. Think about mass extinctions. There is a mass extinction, there is a massive loss of biodiversity, and other species will come and take those niches. That sort of episodes are happening today with climate change. So as some species go extinct, other species can benefit from those processes. And in fact, there are many species that are increasing in population as the environmental crisis gets worse. For example, amphibians, 62% are declining, and only 1% are increasing. You see, so there is an increase, but the proportion is so low that is nearly negligible. Birds today is more than 50% of birds are actually declining, and only 7% are increasing. And they are the most extreme case of increases, and it's only 7% relative to 52%. So while some are benefiting, the proportion is so low. In modern times are a matter of speed, of rates of change. It becomes really problematic, because if you think about mass extinctions in the past that took millions of years or tens of thousands of years, you have this rapid degradation that if you put 500 million years of evolutionary history in a page, in a graph, you will see that the mass extinction looks like a line, but it could be really in time many tens of thousands of years or even millions of years. So biodiversity starts to go extinct in that little window gap that in a plot looks like one line, but it's actually sufficient time for species to go extinct and for others to take over. So you have this turnover because you have time. In the case of the modern extinction crisis, it's a completely different situation, because climate change and environmental destruction is happening in only a couple of decades. I mean, technically from the times of the Industrial Revolution until now, it's just a couple of centuries. And that's where all of this is happening. People sometimes have this argument that why should we worry about human-induced climate change if the climate of the planet has always changed? That's true. It has changed a lot. It has changed constantly. The environment has never been constant, and there have been these episodes of massive explosion of eruptions of volcanoes and contamination of the atmosphere that remains contaminated for sometimes for millions of years, or for at least tens of thousands of years. And yeah, that's an argument that, put that way, is right. The problem is that when you think about the time where these changes are happening, today they are happening at a speed that never happened before. So we are talking about only a couple of hundreds of years, which have been aggravated in the last couple of decades only. Okay, so because we are talking about massive changes in the last couple of decades, urbanization, pollution, greenhouse emissions. Yeah, so the rate of change is so fast that extinctions, that organisms that live in our world are really, really struggling all over the planet to keep up with the changes, to catch up with the changes. The environments are changing way too quick for them. It's just way too fast. So they try, but because is happening in a couple of decades. They are not managing and they are collapsing to extinction. And because it's happening so quick, the replacement of those lost species is not happening at the same rate because evolution of new species tends to have longer time. So in historical periods of mass extinctions, you have massive disruption of the environment, massive levels of climate change, massive levels of global warming. Think about previous mass extinctions have led to 8 degrees of increases relative to the stable time. Today, the average is only 1.1. So that will show you the extent of this, of how bad it is, the increase in temperatures. With only 1.1, we have 28% of organisms facing extinction risk. We have 11,000 to 58,000 species of animals being lost per year. And if those changes of the climate continue, and environmental change, environmental degradation, and all of that continue over time, you know, these numbers are going to get worse. And the problem is that the turnover of biodiversity, these new paradigms of life we have been talking about in the aftermath of mass extinctions, it requires time. So there is asymmetry in the rate at which species are declining to extinction and the ways that the other ones are catching up. And those asymmetries are represented by numbers like 62% of amphibians are declining, reducing in population size. 41% are officially declared as facing extinction risk, but only 1% of amphibians are increasing. So it is a matter of rates, it is a matter of speed, it is a matter of our mass extinction that we are causing is happening too quickly. So biodiversity is just struggling to keep up. They are struggling to follow the pace, and that's why they continue to collapse one after the other.
Yeah, the way I like to think about climate change in this respect is in the past, climate changes on the time scale of like continents drifting. You know, a continent will move over the pole and that'll change the climate there. What we're seeing today is way closer to like the comet hitting Earth and changing everything really quickly.
It is a completely different situation. I mean, compare mass extinctions again that took tens of thousands of years or millions of years with this one that is taking decades. Yeah. A couple of centuries at most. It's just a complete distortion of what life can sustain, that life can tolerate, and it's still fighting for it, fighting for their survival. But the crisis is there, and that's a really important lesson for people that think that the climate of the planet has always changed. That's right, but it's not at the same rate. That is the fundamental problem.
Exactly. And we know some of the other mechanisms as well. We talk a lot about climate change, but there are some other things, even more dramatic things actually that we do to animals to kind of kick them out. And habitat loss is, my understanding, is actually the primary driver of extinction for most animals. And then there's other things like pollution. You can think of that as part of climate change. I guess climate change is sort of all encompassing when you think about all these different changes that we're making. But we know very specifically which mechanisms are causing stress on these animals. We really know what the results of our actions are doing to different animals, right?
Absolutely, yeah. It's not just climate change, but so the way we have to see it is human impacts on the environment. So we think about climate change because first of all, it's global. So climate change is all over the planet. Also, the sort of events we have with climate change are quite nearly science fiction. I mean, if you think about humans causing the level of the ocean to go up, the melting of the poles, the increases in temperature, all those things sound like science fiction. If you said, for example, if you have legislation that can create a national park, a protected area in a certain environment, you will protect that environment from habitat degradation, from building roads, for example, from hunting and all those activities that contribute. But climate change won't respect legal actions. Climate change will continue to happen. You can take any legal actions you want, but climate change will continue to happen. So you can ring fence some areas where habitat degradation or habitat destruction or over exploitation of the biodiversity is happening or stuff like that. But climate change is just this massive force that is encompassing the entire planet. It's causing changes in the conditions of the environment in very high mountains, but also in the deep ocean. It goes in every corner of the planet. which is why we think about climate change as the predominant thing. And again, to some extent, with things like environmental legal actions, we can reduce the extent of loss of certain parts of the planet. If you have a hotspot of biodiversity that you see is declining quickly because of overexploitation of the forest, for example, you could create a measure to protect a certain spot. And you know that the effects could be quite rapid. But the problem with climate change is that it is about the emission of greenhouse that emerge from every activity we have. So we tend to think about, the greenhouse emissions from flying on planes or driving to work, and yeah, they produce something, but the global estimate of greenhouse emissions of transport is something like 16% of the entire thing. Then you think about other human activities like buildings, so cement, steel, plastic, but especially cement and steel, they're responsible for like a third or something like that of the greenhouse emissions. So the extent of the emission of greenhouse gases from other activities that is not traveling is huge. Electricity is responsible for 27% of gas emissions. So again, it's a big issue, the climate change, but it's all about the entire role of human activities. So for example, if you think about greenhouse emissions cause climate change, the production of roads and of buildings with cement and steel is responsible for nearly a third of greenhouse emissions, which leads to climate change. But at the same time, that process is leading to urbanization, and urbanization involves, by definition, the destruction of a natural environment. But when you have too many cities around, you need to create roads. And then to create the roads, you again need more cement and more steel, which will continue to the production of these greenhouse emissions, but it's at the same time causing a fragmentation of the original environments. If you build roads in the middle of an environment, you can fragment it and cause a significant damage to this original natural area. So climate change is, as a concept and as a reality, is something that is very overwhelming to think about. If we stopped our greenhouse emissions now, if we stopped everything now, this 51 billion tons per year, the atmosphere would take several decades to recover. So whatever processes of extinction we have already initiated, even if we stop today, they will happen anyway, because it's going to take decades. And it's estimated that around a quarter of the CO2 that is in the atmosphere will remain in the atmosphere for another 10,000 years or something like that. So it remains there. It takes time for the planet to heal. So even if we stop everything, the problem is not going to solve. So that's why climate change is so overwhelming when we think about it. It's a fact that is everywhere, that affects everybody, that affects pollinators, and as is estimated, 75% of the crops on Earth depend on pollinators, and it turns out pollinators are declining, and that leads to problems that have to do with social inequality, which start to affect this cycle between climate, biodiversity, and humanity. And where do you put your efforts, where you prioritize? And then it leads to inequality, because it turns out that the developed countries produce most of the greenhouse emissions, and the costs are mostly paid by regions of the planet where poverty is really predominant. So the ones that are producing it are not really feeling it at the same level. If there is a massive increase in the levels of rain in places like the United States, Canada, or Europe, we live in houses that are safe enough to tolerate the rains. Of course, some places get flooded and some catastrophes happen. But if you think about areas where people depend on the environment and are more vulnerable to changes in the environment because they cannot access water, because a flood can destroy everything they have. So the impact of all these activities together are very asymmetric when you compare who produces them and who suffers the consequences. But the extent of the damage it's a combination of all our activities: invasive species, overexploitation for food, certainly greenhouse emissions that lead to that, but all of that is related to obviously destruction of natural environments. When we start digging mines to extract gold or diamonds, or to whatever it is, it's just a whole system. And I think it's necessary to see the whole crisis as a network of interact things that actually depend on each other, because none of those things are independent. The one factor in common, the one underlying things that underpins everything, is industrialization in humans. So that really is the human impacts that have different phases, and climate change is an overwhelming one.
There's really like an interconnectedness of everything. And
absolutely,
if we're living in our urban environments, we may not see the changes as dramatically as happening outside. People think, oh, climate change, I can deal with my day being a couple degrees hotter, that doesn't affect me. But it's
not the same for other parts of the world. Even at a more obvious level, we sometimes, when we have access to the financial conditions to kind of offset our contribution to climate change, you start to find some issues. For example, we have, wind power and all those sources of renewable energies that at the moment, the production of volumes of energy they bring to us is really low, but also they have other problems. Is that the energy that they produce, you cannot store it and transport it. So you can have a lot of production of energy in natural ways, but how you will move it to a city to make the city work. So that's why technologies like nuclear power are becoming a serious possibility for it. But it's all about technological innovations that need to happen, and governments need to commit to the investment, and private sectors need to commit to the investment of new technologies. And that's where research institutes and universities are really important, because it's, universities and institutes are the ones that produce basic knowledge, basic technological innovations that will contribute to this, to resolve those issues like charging a car with energy that is contaminating anyway.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you some of your policy prescriptions, because I figured you have some ideas that you've thought about there. So what I'm hearing is that energy is the big one we need to solve if we want to help reduce our impact on the environment and the animals in it. So we want to reduce energy. We want to change our sources of energy.
Yes, definitely.
Then, yeah. Okay.
So I mean, resolving the energy, the production of energy is certainly a key thing, because climate change is fundamentally the outcome of many things that require energy, for the production of things that are vital for us. Every time you switch on your computer, every time you play with your phone, every time you drive to work, you are in one way or another contributing to climate change, because your activities are like, every time you switch on the light to go to the toilet is contributing. All that has to come from somewhere. So the new paradigms of production of energy are really critical. But if we try to focus on a bigger picture, I think there are three elements that are really critical to deal with the problem. The first one is science. We need science because we need to understand all these processes at a very fundamental level. We need to understand what is causing the changes, where the changes are happening, what are the rates of the changes, and what are the consequences of them. And we need to be able to quantify when a problem that emerges from climate change will be happening and where, so that way we can adapt, we can mitigate. So we need science to understand the problem from a very fundamental perspective, but we also need science to develop technological innovations. Okay, we can't think about the future as a linear tendency of the present. The present is not necessarily a precise prediction of the future. So for example, when there were these debates in the 70s about the tendencies in human growth, that by the end of the century, there could be, I don't know what crazy number of people, and most of biodiversity could be dead. Well, it turns out that as these things happen, as the climate continues to change, we are constantly producing technologies that before were unthinkable. Okay, so at the beginning of the 90s, a powerful computer was probably not as powerful as your smartphone. So all these technological innovations are critical, and they are to me, the key to really break these linear tendencies of increasing climate because of increasing productivity of things that are required for the maintenance of a growing population of humans. If we have technologies that change those paradigms, we could really offset the emission of greenhouses. So science is fundamental. Second, we need education. Education is really critical because we need to train growing generations in many different aspects. We need to make sure that people understand that climate change is a problem, that is an overwhelming problem that is everywhere, that respecting the environment and playing your part is important. So we need to create a collective sense of understanding of the extent of the problem, how everybody contributes. I have been involved in some conversations or previous debate about the problem of climate change, and there is this idea that some people have that climate change is because of massive companies. So it's very easy to blame others and say, you know, it's all these extractivist companies that are responsible for climate change. But it turns out that every activity we engage in is contributing to it. So we all contributed to it, and we all can do something about it. So we need education for people to understand that this is a real problem, that everybody can play a part, and we need to be able to think about the generations that are coming. So science, education, and from those emerged the third one, which is cooperation. It's very critical. It's very critical to cooperate, to everybody take part in the actions in one way or another. We need to understand that the production of greenhouse emissions that is massive in developed countries is impacting more badly countries that are struggling to even drink clean water. So cooperation, governance, this sense of, you know, collective fight against a problem that is impacting everybody. It's impacting our welfare. It's impacting the production of food. It's impacting the crops we all depend on. It's impacting the spread of diseases. You know, tropical latitudes have lots of tropical diseases, and as the environments get hotter, those diseases will continue to expand. So this is a problem that impacts everybody, that impacts life around us, and that's why we need science, education, and cooperation.
Okay, that's a pretty optimistic ending, I think. Is that because you can kind of see the path forward, that you think that it's achievable? And
yeah, I mean, I think we are making progress, but it's inevitable to feel sometimes I'll be pessimistic about things, about how things happen. I want to be optimistic. I want to think that new technologies, new collective perspectives on climate change will lead to changes. We probably won't achieve the goals like the Paris Agreement and those sort of goals we have, but we need more. We need to engage more. Governments need to engage more. The private sector need to engage more. The public need to engage more in the whole thing. So more than optimistic about the outcome, I'm optimistic about what people in technological innovation and scientific research at fundamental levels can contribute to it, to equip humanity with what we need to mitigate this catastrophe and to avoid it to become irreversible, to reach what we call the tipping points, which is when you reach a point where the problem is irreversible. We still have some operating space, and we have enough technological advancements that will probably lead to other technologies. It's a gradual process. So we have all these things that are probably moving in the right direction, are certainly moving in the right direction. But I'm optimistic about the potential if we do things right, rather than being optimistic about how things will turn out to be. If we take the right actions, I'm optimistic that we will get there. The question is whether we will take the right actions.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, that's all the questions I have for you.
It has been an absolute pleasure, Matt, to speak to you today. Loads of different topics, like a marathon for the mind.
Yeah, really. I appreciate you going through I had this thing mapped out and you just truck right through the whole thing. I really appreciate that.
Take care. And any questions, just let me know.